Something that keeps getting brought up is the question of driverless tube trains. Every time there's a strike or a staff shortage, someone asks why we bother with drivers on the London Underground at all. After all, they continue, we've had driverless trains on the Docklands Light Railway since the 1980s. In fact, the government refused to provide the cash-strapped TfL with a much-needed loan last year unless they agreed to investigate the possibility of introducing driverless trains with the Department of Transport. Well, I could have saved everyone a lot of time and money by telling you that it's not going to happen. But they didn't ask me, so here we are. What have we learned? Now, before we begin, I should point out that driverless trains on the tube have been possible for about 60 years at this point. They were first tested in 1963 and were intended to be put into service on the Victoria Line in 1968. But passengers reacted negatively to the sight of a train with no one in the cab, so they got drivers in the end. If you look at the 1967 stock trains built for the Victoria Line, they don't have cab side doors. The only way into the cab was through the main passenger section, because in the normal course of things, London Underground didn't anticipate that people would need to get into the cab easily. Trains are partially automated on several lines. There's a lot to be said for partial automation. It reduces the risk of human error, most obviously. So why not go the whole hog? So the first point we need to make is that DLR trains are not technically driverless. They just don't call them drivers. They're known as passenger service agents, or I've also heard the term train captains. And their job is mainly to perform the functions of a guard, but also a driver. Trains need to be driven manually to and from the depot, and also, if there's a problem, the PSAs take over from the automatic controls. You would need to introduce a similar system on the tube. Arguably this would be more necessary there, because of course so much of the network is underground, and if there's an emergency you really need someone who knows what they're doing. If there was a strike, the network would still grind to a halt. But staffing issues aside, another reason it's never going to happen is money. Going driverless is not simply a matter of putting a brick on the accelerator. Modern subway tunnels, such as those on the Northern Line Battersea extension, the Elizabeth Line and the DLR, are built with gangways to one side and frequent emergency exits. This means that in the event of an emergency, trains can be evacuated quickly and safely. The trouble is, most of the tunnels on the network are not modern subway tunnels. They were built on a budget over many decades, starting in the 1860s and finishing in the 1990s. Their builders had no interest in these safety precautions, but they'd be absolutely essential if the trains were to go driverless. So the tunnels would need to be widened. This is a very difficult task. It has been done before. The city in South London was widened just before the First World War, and they nearly buried a train full of passengers in the process. But that was when it was owned by a syndicate of deep-pocketed American investors. It wasn't paid for out of fares, which ultimately this rebuild would have to be. And it goes without saying that this was just one line. Remember how the city branch of the Northern Line had to be closed last year for 17 weeks for the rebuild of Bank Station? Imagine that, but on every line, for years on end. As well as widening the tunnels, you'd need to rebuild a lot of the stations. Platform edge doors, like those on the Jubilee extension and the Elizabeth Line, would need to be installed on every platform. Many platforms are at different heights, so they would also need to be raised or lowered. And I don't know what you'd do at places like Acton Town, where trains of different heights use the same platforms. I guess you'd have to rethink the track layout or get rid of one of the services. Stations with severe curves, like Bank on the Central Line, would need to be redug, because platform edge doors can't be installed on tight curves. Mind the gap, indeed. You would need better surveillance and communication equipment. The station staff would need to be able to see everywhere at all times, taking on many of the duties currently performed by drivers in the station. Trains and signalling would need to be modified, if not outright replaced. All this introduces new maintenance requirements. There would be a lot of systems that would all have to work perfectly. Software glitches are an absolute nightmare on trains. Recently, the Elizabeth Line trains have been suffering breakdowns as a result of software issues, and they aren't even driverless. So you'd probably need to think in terms of hiring more technicians who would need to be on top of things all the time. Remember, the Underground carries something in the region of 5 million passengers every day. Even then, though, you couldn't do that everywhere. There are places where the Tube shares track with other trains. I'm thinking of the District Line branch to Richmond, the Metropolitan to Amersham, and the Bakerloo to Harrow and Wealdstone. So, either you'd need to abandon automation, or you'd need to convince those guys to automate as well, or you'd have to look at cutting one of the services. Which raises other questions. For instance, would Chiltern Railways be willing to lay on extra trains to carry the Metropolitan Line's passengers to Amersham? But ultimately, the fate lies with those who hold the purse strings. A leaked internal TfL document from 2020 estimates the cost at £7 billion. Now, other estimates put the cost at more like $5.6 billion, but even so, that's a lot of money. I mean, that's more than I've got in my pocket right now. Where are these billions of pounds going to come from? TfL is in the normal course of things expected to largely fund itself. The government was reluctant to loan them even $1 billion back in 2021, and that was just to keep the network going. Would they now loan them 5 to 7 times that? And if so, what would they get for it? They wouldn't remove the risk of strikes, which is one of the big things that politicians promise. TfL could reduce their outgoing expenses by losing some staff, but they would also need to recruit staff, as discussed earlier. One other consideration that I've not seen mentioned elsewhere is that of morale among remaining staff. Speaking as someone who used to work for the NHS in a support capacity, there are few things more likely to reduce morale among the workforce than the knowledge that upper management, as a matter of policy, would get rid of you if they could. Poor morale manifests in high staff turnover and long-term sick leave, which also costs money. So all in all, I don't think you'd save much on staff. So how else would one recoup the costs? Now, of course, one could point to the Elizabeth Line, which cost a lot of money and was hugely successful. It repays its investment. But that was a new service that had been needed for about 90 years. It brings new passengers onto TfL. Full automation of the Underground would result in the same service, but no drivers. Perhaps frequency could be increased, but not much beyond what we already have. The service in central London is ludicrously frequent. Then we need to consider that the constant closure of different sections of the tube might well drive people away from the network. So income would likely drop over the period of the rebuild. There would be a period of catching up as you lure people back onto the tube. In all honesty, I think even 7 billion might be optimistic, because you need to more or less rebuild the network from the ground up. Or down, I suppose. Ultimately, I think driverless trains are just something politicians like to talk about without actually understanding the implications. A driverless underground network is not happening. Probably ever. You're welcome, everyone. Well, I hope you enjoyed this fully automated tale from the tube. If you did, please do hit the like button and consider subscribing for more. I would like to thank my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon, and here on YouTube for your always generous support. You are the gangway to my tunnel. And I'll see you all again very soon for another tale from the tube.